hand extends from the shadows of a Roman archway. The fingers are gnarled, thick with old calluses that speak of decades gripping sword hilts and reins. But the hand trembles now. It holds a wooden cup, and the cup is empty. The feet passing by kick dust into the air. Merchants, slaves, soldiers in polished armour that has never seen blood. None of them stop. None of them look down at the figure slumped against the cold stone, wrapped in a cloak so threadbare it cannot hide the sores beneath. The smell rising from him is the smell of decay. Not death, not yet, but something worse. The slow rot of a man still breathing. His eyes are gone, not closed, not covered. Gone. Two dark hollows stare at nothing, crusted at the edges where the burning iron did its work. Flies circle but do not land. Even insects know there is nothing left here worth consuming. A child throws a coin. It misses the cup, pings against the stone, rolls into a crack between paving slabs. The blind man does not reach for it. He has forgotten how to want things. Constantinople moves around him like water around a stone. The greatest city in the world. The heart of an empire that stretches from Spain to Persia, from the Danube to the Nile. 40 years ago, this empire was a corpse waiting for burial. The legions were shattered. The treasury was empty. The barbarian kingdoms had carved the western provinces into a dozen petty fiefdoms, and educated men debated not whether Rome would fall, but how much longer the death rattle would last. Then one man reversed it all, one general, one impossible campaign after another. Africa reclaimed in a single season. Italy reconquered inch by bloody inch. Persia held at bay when Persian armies outnumbered Roman defenders 10-1. He fought battles that tacticians still study. He won wars that emperors still take credit for. He saved the Roman Empire from extinction. Not once, not twice, but so many times that historians lost count. His name was Flavius Belisarius, and now he sits blind and begging at the gates of the city he saved, and the crowds walk past without recognizing the greatest military mind their civilization ever produced. This is not legend. This is not dramatic exaggeration. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who served on Belisarius' staff and recorded his campaigns in obsessive detail, confirms the blindness, the property seizures, the public humiliation of a man whose only crime was being too competent, too successful, too beloved by soldiers who should have loved only the emperor. The empire Belisarius saved would rule for another 900 years after his death. His campaigns would be studied at military academies for 15 centuries. His name would be spoken alongside Alexander and Caesar as one of history's supreme tacticians. But the man himself, the actual human being who bled and starved and watched his soldiers die, and still somehow kept winning, the empire threw him away like a broken tool. Not his enemies, not the Vandals or Goths or Persians he had crushed, his own government, his own emperor, the very system he had spent his entire life serving with a loyalty so absolute it bordered on pathological. Historians still debate whether Justinian truly believed Belisarius was plotting against him, or whether the emperor simply could not tolerate the existence of a man more beloved than himself. But the result is beyond debate. The greatest general Rome ever produced died in poverty and darkness, erased from the triumph he had made possible. How does a man save an empire and lose everything? How does loyalty become the instrument of your own destruction? And what does it tell us about power, about systems, about the men who serve them, when the reward for saving Rome is to be blinded by it? The smell of goat dung and wood smoke. That was the world Belisarius was born into, sometime around 505 AD, in a village called Germania on the edge of Thrace. Not the Germania of the Germanic tribes. This was a tiny settlement in what is now Bulgaria, perched on the border between Roman civilization and the howling wilderness beyond. The frontier, the edge, the place where Rome ended and chaos began. His father was probably a farmer, possibly a minor landowner with enough resources to ensure his son could read and write, but not enough to matter in Constantinople. No noble blood, no senatorial connections, no inherited wealth to smooth the path toward power. Belisarius entered the world with nothing but his body and his mind, and in the Roman Empire of the 6th century, that meant exactly one path upward. The army. He enlisted young, 15, perhaps 16, as a common soldier in the household guard of the future Emperor Justinian, who was then merely the nephew and heir apparent of the aging Justin I. This was not coincidence. Justinian was collecting talented young men the way other nobles collected art. He needed tools, weapons, men who would owe their entire existence to his patronage and could therefore be trusted absolutely. Belisarius fit the profile perfectly. Brilliant, ambitious, desperate to escape the mud and obscurity of Thrace, and utterly dependent on Justinian's favour for any hope of advancement. The bargain was unspoken but absolute. Serve well, win victories, never question, never threaten, never allow yourself to become more important than the man who made you. For 3 decades, Belisarius would honour that bargain with a fidelity that bordered on self-destruction, and Justinian would eventually reward that fidelity by taking his eyes. But first came the education. The late Roman army was not the legion of Augustus. The infantry phalanx had given way to cavalry dominance. The short gladius had been replaced by the long spather. The tactics that had conquered Gaul and Britain were obsolete against the mounted archers of Persia and the mobile warbands of the Gothic tribes. Belisarius absorbed it all. He studied the Persian cataphracts, armoured horsemen who could punch through infantry lines like iron fists through wet cloth. He analysed the Hun horse archers who had terrorised Europe a century earlier, noting how their mobility made traditional Roman formations useless. He examined the failures of recent Roman commanders who had tried to fight 6th century wars with 3rd century methods, and then he synthesised. The force Belisarius would eventually lead, his Bucellarii, his personal retainers, became something new in Roman warfare. Heavy cavalry who could fight in close formation like cataphracts, but who also carried bows and could skirmish like steppe nomads. Infantry who could form defensive squares but also advance in flexible units. Combined arms, coordinated manoeuvre, speed and shock integrated into a single devastating package. He trained them relentlessly, not just in weapons drill but in logistics, in engineering, in the grinding administrative work that separates a rabble from an army. His men learned to build fortifications in hours. They learned to forage without alienating local populations. They learned to march faster, dig deeper, endure longer than any force they would face. By his early 20s, Belisarius commanded his own cavalry unit. By 25, he was leading independent operations on the Persian frontier. By 30, he would be given command of the most ambitious military expedition in Roman history. But there was a cost to this education, a psychological price that would shape everything that followed. Belisarius learned that success depended entirely on the emperor's favour, not on merit, not on victory, on the continued goodwill of a man in Constantinople who could elevate you to glory or crush you to nothing with a single word. He watched other officers rise and fall, men promoted beyond their competence because they flattered well, men destroyed despite their competence because they threatened the wrong courtier. The lesson was unmistakable. In the Byzantine system, being good at your job was necessary but not sufficient. You also had to be safe, unthreatening, visibly subordinate. Historians still debate whether this understanding made Belisarius a wiser servant or a broken one, whether his legendary obedience was genuine loyalty or elaborate survival strategy, whether the boy from Thrace ever truly believed in the empire he served or simply recognized that belief was the price of escape from the mud. What is certain is this. By the time Justinian became emperor in 527 AD, Belisarius had mastered both arts, warfare and submission. He knew how to win battles. He knew how to appear harmless while winning them. He did not yet know that the second skill would matter more than the first, and he did not know that no amount of submission would ever be enough. The year Justinian took the throne, the Roman Empire was a ghost pretending to be alive. On paper, the emperor in Constantinople still claimed sovereignty over the entire Mediterranean world. The maps in the imperial archives still showed Roman provinces stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara. The legal fiction persisted that the barbarian kings ruling Italy, Africa and Spain were merely temporary occupiers, regents holding Roman territory until such time as the legitimate government chose to reclaim it. The reality was rotting infrastructure, empty treasuries, and armies that existed primarily as payroll lists rather than fighting forces. The Vandals had held Africa for a century. The Ostrogoths controlled Italy. The Visigoths ruled Spain. Roman power had contracted to the eastern Mediterranean, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Egypt. And even there, the Persian Empire pressed constantly against the frontier, demanding tribute, seizing fortresses, reminding Constantinople that survival was not guaranteed. Justinian looked at this inheritance and saw not decline but opportunity. He was not a soldier. He had never commanded troops in battle, never felt the weight of armour or the terror of a cavalry charge. But he possessed something more dangerous than military experience: vision. Absolute, burning, uncompromising vision. He would restore Rome, not the diminished eastern remnant, but the full empire of Augustus and Trajan. He would reconquer Africa. He would reconquer Italy. He would reunite the Mediterranean under a single Christian emperor and prove that Roman civilization was not dead, merely sleeping. This was insanity. Every advisor told him so. The treasury could not support offensive wars. The army could not project power across the Mediterranean. The Persians would exploit any Western adventure to strike in the east. The plan defied logistics, economics, and common military sense. Justinian did not care. He had God on his side. He had legal arguments. He had theological certainty that Rome's mission was not complete. What he needed was a weapon. He found one in Belisarius. Their relationship is one of history's most studied and least understood partnerships. Justinian recognized military genius but could not perform it himself. Belisarius possessed that genius but required imperial resources to deploy it. They needed each other, and that mutual need created a bond stronger than friendship but more fragile than trust. Justinian gave Belisarius armies. Belisarius gave Justinian victories. The exchange seemed simple. It was not. Because every victory Belisarius won made him more famous, more beloved by soldiers, more celebrated by crowds. And Justinian, sitting in Constantinople, watching the dispatches arrive, found himself confronting an impossible problem. He needed Belisarius to succeed, but every success made Belisarius more dangerous. The first test came in 530 AD at Dara, on the Persian frontier. Belisarius commanded perhaps 15,000 men against a Persian army of 40,000. The terrain offered no advantages. Roman morale was fragile after years of defeats. Standard military logic said to retreat to avoid battle to preserve forces for more favourable circumstances. Belisarius attacked. He had spent weeks preparing the battlefield, digging trenches that channeled the Persian cavalry into killing zones, positioning his horse archers where they could flank without exposing themselves, coordinating infantry and cavalry in a dance of murder that the Persians had never encountered. The sound of that battle echoed across the ancient world, the screaming of horses, the crack of lance on shield, the wet tearing of flesh as Byzantine cavalry carved through Persian formations from unexpected angles. 10,000 Persians died. The survivors fled. It was the first major Roman victory against Persia in generations. Constantinople erupted in celebration. Justinian basked in reflected glory. And somewhere in the back of the imperial mind, a small voice whispered, "This man is becoming too important." But there was no time to address that concern, because across the Mediterranean, an opportunity had emerged. The Vandal kingdom in Africa was tearing itself apart in civil war. The usurper Gelimer had overthrown the legitimate king, providing Justinian with a legal pretext for intervention. Africa, the breadbasket of the ancient world, lost for 100 years, recoverable now if someone could lead an expedition across the sea and crush the Vandals before they reunited. Historians still debate whether Justinian chose Belisarius for this mission because he trusted him, or because he hoped the expedition would fail spectacularly, removing a potential rival. The sources suggest both motives coexisted in the emperor's mind without contradiction. Belisarius received his orders: 15,000 men, 500 transport ships, a journey of over 1,000 miles across open water, no reinforcements, no second chances. If he failed, the empire would lose an irreplaceable army, and Justinian would lose his dreams of restoration. If he succeeded, he would become the most celebrated general since Julius Caesar. Either outcome solved Justinian's problem. Only one solved Belisarius's. He sailed for Africa in June of 533 AD, carrying the hopes of an empire and the seeds of his own destruction. The African coast materialized through morning haze on September 1st, 533 AD. Belisarius stood at the prow of his flagship, watching the beaches resolve into clarity, and felt the weight of everything that could go wrong pressing against his chest like armour he could not remove. 3 months at sea. Storms had scattered his fleet twice. Disease had killed horses and weakened men. Water supplies were dangerously low. His soldiers, most of whom had never sailed beyond the sight of land, were demoralised, seasick, convinced they were being led to slaughter on a foreign shore. And somewhere inland, the Vandal army waited. 80,000 warriors, according to the most optimistic estimates. Men whose grandfathers had sacked Rome itself. Men who had crushed every Roman force sent against them for a century. Belisarius had 15,000 soldiers fit to fight. The landing itself was a masterwork of logistics. His troops came ashore in coordinated waves, establishing defensive perimeters before the Vandals could react. Foraging parties secured food and water with minimal violence against local populations. Belisarius had issued strict orders against looting, knowing that Roman legitimacy depended on being seen as liberators rather than invaders. The smell of African soil, dry earth baked by a sun more intense than anything his Thracian soldiers had experienced, the taste of dust on cracked lips, the sound of armour jingling as 15,000 men formed into column and began the march toward Carthage. King Gelimer had made a catastrophic miscalculation. He had divided his forces, sending his brother Amytas to hold Carthage, while he gathered the main army to crush the Romans in a pincer movement. The plan was sound on paper. In execution, it fell apart because Gelimer had never faced an opponent who moved as fast as Belisarius. The Battle of Ad Decimum, 10 miles from Carthage, lasted less than 2 hours. Belisarius caught Amytas's advance force before it could link up with Gelimer's main army. His cavalry struck from the flanks while the Vandal column was still strung out along the road, unable to form proper battle lines. Amytas died in the first charge, his chest opened by a Roman lance. His soldiers, seeing their commander fall, broke and ran. By the time Gelimer arrived with the main army, he found not the trapped Roman force he expected, but a battlefield carpeted with Vandal dead, and a Byzantine cavalry formation already wheeling to meet him. The Vandal king was not a coward. He was not incompetent. But he looked at his brother's corpse, looked at the Roman cavalry advancing with methodical precision, and felt something break inside him. According to Procopius, Gelimer dismounted beside Amytas's body and began to weep. His army, leaderless in the crucial moment, dissolved into chaos. Carthage fell without resistance. The population welcomed the Romans as liberators from Vandal oppression. Belisarius entered the city in triumph, accepting the surrender of the Vandal garrison, securing the royal treasury, restoring the ancient churches the Vandals had converted to their Arian heresy. In 2 weeks, he had accomplished what generations of Roman emperors had dreamed of. Africa was Roman again. The news reached Constantinople in October. Justinian declared a triumph, the first legitimate Roman triumph in over 600 years. Belisarius was summoned home to receive honours not granted since the days of the Republic, and here the poison began to seep in. Because Belisarius did not simply win, he won too completely, he won too quickly, he won with a fraction of the resources that should have been necessary. And in winning, he accumulated something far more dangerous than victory: treasure. The Vandal royal treasury contained wealth accumulated over a century of Mediterranean piracy and African taxation. Gold, silver, jewels, enough to fund entire wars, and by right of conquest, a substantial portion belonged to Belisarius personally. He also accumulated something else: soldiers, Vandal warriors who surrendered and swore allegiance to the general who had defeated them, Berber auxiliaries who offered their services. His Bucellari swelled to a private army of 7,000 men, larger than many imperial field forces. Historians still debate whether Belisarius understood how dangerous this made him appear. A general with his own treasury, his own army, the adoration of soldiers who had followed him across the sea and back. In the paranoid calculus of Byzantine politics, such a man was either absolutely loyal or absolutely lethal. There was no middle ground. Justinian watched the triumph from his throne. He smiled. He bestowed honours. He named Belisarius consul, the highest remaining republican dignity. But the emperor's eyes tracked the cheering crowds, the soldiers chanting Belisarius's name, the way ordinary Romans pressed forward to touch the general's cloak as if he were a saint. Justinian smiled, and somewhere behind that smile the first calculations of betrayal began. The order came before Belisarius had finished unpacking his African trophies. Italy, immediately. The Ostrogothic kingdom was vulnerable, and Justinian would not wait. Belisarius requested reinforcements. He received 7,500 men. barely half what he'd commanded in Africa, against an enemy that fielded armies of 100,000 or more. The message was unmistakable: win with what you have, or die with what you have. Either outcome served the emperor's purposes. Sicily fell in 535 AD. The Gothic garrisons were weak, demoralised, scattered across an island they had never bothered to fortify properly. Belisarius swept through in weeks, his reputation preceding him like a plague. Gothic commanders surrendered rather than face the man who had annihilated the Vandals. Then came the Italian mainland, and everything changed. The Gothic king Theodahad was a scholar, not a warrior. He offered to surrender Italy entirely in exchange for a comfortable retirement in Constantinople. Justinian rejected the terms. He wanted unconditional submission, not negotiated transfer. By the time Theodahad realised that negotiation had failed, Belisarius had already landed at Rhegium and begun the march north. Naples resisted. The city's Gothic garrison and substantial Jewish population, who feared Byzantine persecution, refused to open the gates. Belisarius besieged the city for 20 days, his army growing weaker while the walls stood firm. Then his engineers found an abandoned aqueduct. The smell of that tunnel, ancient stone sweating moisture that had accumulated for centuries, the scrape of armour against walls so narrow that soldiers had to advance single file, the darkness so complete that men navigated by touch, by the breathing of the soldier ahead, by the distant echo of dripping water. 400 men crawled through that passage. They emerged inside Naples at midnight, overwhelmed the guards at the nearest gate, and opened the city to Belisarius's army. What followed was massacre. The soldiers, enraged by the long siege and the deprivations they had suffered, ignored Belisarius's orders for restraint. They poured through the streets of Naples, killing indiscriminately. Men, women, children. The Jewish quarter burned. The screaming lasted until dawn. Belisarius rode through the aftermath in silence, bodies piled in doorways, blood pooling in gutters, the survivors who had hidden in cellars emerging to find their families butchered. He restored order. He punished the worst offenders. He distributed food to the survivors and posted guards to prevent further violence. But something had shifted. The war he had imagined, quick, surgical, liberating Italy from barbarian rule, had revealed its true face. This would not be Africa. This would be a grinding, brutal, years-long nightmare that would consume armies and populations alike. Rome itself opened its gates in December 536. The Gothic garrison fled north rather than face Belisarius. The Eternal City, unconquered for 800 years until the Visigoths sacked it in 410, was Roman again. The celebration lasted exactly 40 days. Then the Gothic king Vitiges arrived with an army of 150,000 warriors and laid siege to the city that Belisarius held with 5,000 men. A year. The siege lasted a year. The hunger began within weeks. Belisarius rationed everything: grain, meat, water from the aqueducts the Goths had cut. His soldiers ate horses, then dogs, then rats. The civilian population starved in silence, too weak to complain, while the general walked the walls calculating how many more days they could endure. 14 major assaults. The Goths threw everything they had against the Aurelian walls, and every time Belisarius's defenders, skeletal, exhausted, fighting on willpower alone, threw them back. The general himself fought on the walls during the worst attacks, his armour dented, his sword arm aching, his voice hoarse from shouting commands. Historians still debate whether Belisarius should have retreated, preserved his army, waited for reinforcements that might never come. The sources suggest he never considered it. Rome was Rome. The symbol mattered more than the strategic reality. If he abandoned the Eternal City, the entire Italian campaign would collapse. By March 538, the Goths had lost 50,000 men to combat disease and desertion. Vitiges lifted the siege and retreated north. Belisarius had won, but the cost. His army was shattered. His health was broken. The Italian population, caught between Gothic vengeance and Byzantine taxation, had begun to view the liberators with the same hatred they once reserved for the barbarians. And in Constantinople, Justinian received reports of Belisarius's heroic defence and felt not gratitude but fear. Because Belisarius had held Rome with 5,000 men against 150,000. He had performed the impossible. Again, and every impossible victory made the question harder to ignore. What happens when such a man decides he wants more than victory? Her name was Antonina. She was older than Belisarius by at least a decade. Her father had been a charioteer, a profession one step above slavery in Byzantine social hierarchy. Her mother had been an actress, which in 6th century Constantinople meant prostitute. Before her marriage, Antonina herself had followed her mother's profession, bearing multiple children by multiple fathers, accumulating debts and enemies and a reputation that respectable society never forgot. Belisarius married her anyway. He loved her with an intensity that his contemporaries found baffling and his soldiers found humiliating. This brilliant general, this conqueror of nations, followed his wife like a lovesick boy. He defended her honour against all accusations. He trusted her absolutely in matters both personal and political. She betrayed him with his own adopted son. The affair with Theodosius was common knowledge in the Byzantine court. Servants whispered about it. Officers discussed it over wine. Everyone knew except Belisarius, or perhaps he knew, and could not bear to acknowledge it. The sources are unclear on his awareness, but they are unanimous on the affair's reality. Procopius, who served Belisarius for years and initially praised him as Rome's greatest hero, eventually wrote a second history, the Secret History, that painted Antonina as a demon in human form, a manipulator, a poisoner of enemies, a woman who controlled her husband through sorcery and sexual domination. Modern historians dismiss the supernatural elements. They cannot dismiss the documented pattern. Antonina's enemies disappeared. Her allies prospered. Her husband's career rose and fell in precise correlation with her relationship to the Empress Theodora. Because Antonina and Theodora were bound by ties stronger than friendship. Theodora, like Antonina, had risen from the theatre, from the same world of performance and prostitution that respectable Byzantium pretended did not exist. She had caught Justinian's eye through beauty and intelligence, had become first his mistress, then his wife, then the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean world. The Empress never forgot her origins. She surrounded herself with women from similar backgrounds, creating a parallel power structure within the court. Antonina was her closest confidant, her spy, her instrument for controlling the military through controlling its greatest general. The arrangement worked beautifully, as long as Belisarius remained necessary and obedient. In Italy, necessity was fraying. The Gothic War dragged on. Vitiges had retreated but not surrendered. Ravenna, the Gothic capital, remained untaken. The Italian countryside, devastated by years of fighting, could no longer support armies of any size. Belisarius requested reinforcements, received instead orders to accomplish more with less. And then the Goths offered him a crown. It happened in 540 AD, during negotiations for Ravenna's surrender. The Gothic nobles, recognizing that their cause was lost, proposed a remarkable solution. Belisarius would become Emperor of the West. He would rule Italy as an independent sovereign, allied with but not subordinate to Constantinople. The Goths would serve him as they had served Theodoric. The war would end, everyone would win, everyone except Justinian. Historians still debate whether Belisarius ever seriously considered the offer. The sources suggest he did not, that he played along only to gain entry to Ravenna, that he always intended to betray the Goths and deliver their kingdom to Constantinople. But intention matters less than perception. Belisarius accepted the offer. He entered Ravenna in triumph. He captured the Gothic king. He seized the Gothic treasury. And then he announced that he had never intended to become emperor, that his loyalty to Justinian was absolute, that the whole negotiation had been a ruse to achieve bloodless victory. The Goths felt cheated. Many of them preferred destruction to the humiliation of being tricked by a man they had tried to honour. And Justinian felt something worse than cheated. He felt afraid. Because Belisarius had been offered an empire. The most brilliant general alive had been offered supreme power, and he had held it in his hands, and he claimed to have rejected it. Claimed, Theodora whispered in her husband's ear. Antonina reported every rumour from the camp. The courtiers who envied Belisarius's glory added their own embellishments. By the time Belisarius returned to Constantinople in 540, expecting triumph, the atmosphere had curdled into something poisonous. No triumph was granted, no celebration organised. Belisarius was received coldly, his victories acknowledged without enthusiasm. his requests for resources denied or delayed. The message was clear. He had flown too close to the sun. He had been offered a crown and had not died refusing it loudly enough. The Italian command was given to other generals, lesser men who lost every advantage Belisarius had won. Within 2 years, the Goths had reconquered most of the peninsula. Belisarius watched from Constantinople, forbidden to intervene, as everything he had built collapsed. The Persian attack came while Italy burned. King Khosrow I, the most capable Persian monarch in centuries, had watched Justinian's western adventures with calculating patience. Every legion sent to Italy was a legion not defending the eastern frontier. Every gold solidus spent on Gothic wars was a solidus not available for Persian bribes and tributes. In 540 AD, the same year Belisarius captured Ravenna, Khosrow invaded Syria. The great city of Antioch fell in June. The Persians breached the walls at dawn, when the morning light cast long shadows across the defensive towers, and what followed was systematic annihilation. Not the chaotic massacre of Naples. This was organised, methodical. The Persians worked through the city quarter by quarter, killing the men, enslaving the women and children, stripping the churches of every ornament worth carrying. The smell of Antioch's destruction carried for miles, burning timber, burning flesh, the copper tang of blood pooling in streets that had been Roman for 600 years. Justinian had no choice. He needed Belisarius. The summons arrived in Constantinople like an admission of failure. The general who had been frozen out for daring to be offered a crown was now essential again. The eastern frontier was collapsing. The armies sent to stop Khosrow had accomplished nothing. Only one man could salvage the situation. Belisarius accepted without complaint. He did not remind the emperor of his recent treatment. He did not demand apologies or guarantees. He gathered what forces could be spared and marched east because that was what he did. That was what he had always done. The campaign of 541 AD demonstrated everything that made Belisarius extraordinary and everything that made him vulnerable. He had no army. Not really. The forces available were fragments, garrison troops, provincial levies, the remnants of units shattered in earlier Persian victories. His Bucelari remained loyal, but they numbered only a few thousand against a Persian empire that could field hundreds of thousands. So Belisarius did not fight. He manoeuvred. He appeared where the Persians did not expect him. He threatened supply lines without committing to battle. He made Khosrow uncertain, cautious, unwilling to advance while a Roman force of unknown size lurked on his flanks. The ground beneath Persian feet seemed to shift. They would march toward one objective only to receive reports of Roman cavalry behind them. They would fortify a position only to find Belisarius had bypassed it entirely. The dust clouds on the horizon never resolved into the decisive engagement Khosrow needed. By autumn, the Persian offensive had stalled. Khosrow withdrew to consolidate his gains, negotiate terms, wait for a better opportunity. The eastern frontier stabilized. Belisarius had saved the empire again, with almost nothing, through pure operational brilliance, and the court in Constantinople rewarded him with suspicion. The pattern was becoming unmistakable. Every success increased his danger. Every demonstration of competence reminded Justinian how dependent the empire had become on a single man, and how vulnerable the emperor would be if that man ever decided to act in his own interest. The whispers intensified. Courtiers who had never held a sword criticized Belisarius's decisions. Officials who had never faced a Persian army questioned why he had not won more decisively. The same voices that had demanded he save the East now demanded explanations for why the East was not saved more thoroughly. Antonina navigated these currents with her usual skill, maintaining her connection to Theodora, feeding information in both directions. But even she could feel the ground shifting beneath them. In 542 AD, plague struck Constantinople. The disease came from Egypt, bubonic plague, the same pestilence that would return 8 centuries later to kill a third of Europe. It spread through the crowded capital with terrifying speed. The streets filled with corpses. The living could not bury the dead fast enough. Funeral pyres burned day and night, their smoke mixing with the fog rolling off the Bosphorus until the entire city seemed wrapped in a shroud. Justinian himself fell ill. For days the emperor lay in his chambers, burning with fever, while the court held its breath and plotted for the succession. Belisarius was in the east. If Justinian died, who would control the empire? Who would command the armies? The general's name was on every lip, spoken with hope by some, with fear by others, with calculating ambition by most. Historians still debate whether Belisarius considered seizing power during those fevered days. The sources suggest he did not, that he continued his campaign as if the emperor's health were not in question, as if the opportunity for supreme power were not dangling before him. But again, intention mattered less than perception. Justinian recovered, and he remembered every name that had been spoken during his illness, every courtier who had positioned themselves for a new regime, every general whose loyalty had seemed conditional. Belisarius's name was on the list. The trap was closing, and the general could not see the walls rising around him. The recall order arrived without explanation. Belisarius was in Mesopotamia, holding together a defensive line with inadequate forces, when the imperial courier appeared with sealed documents bearing Justinian's personal seal. Return to Constantinople, immediately. Surrender command to subordinates. Do not delay, no reason given, no charges specified. Just the summons, cold and absolute, from an emperor who had learned to communicate displeasure through silence. The journey west took weeks. Belisarius travelled without his busolari, without the trappings of command, like a common traveller rather than Rome's greatest general. The roads that had once welcomed him as a conquering hero now felt hostile, watched, full of eyes reporting his every movement back to the capital. Constantinople's gates opened for him in the winter of 542. The city was still recovering from the plague, mass graves dotted the outskirts, and the population had been cut by nearly half. The stench of death lingered in neighbourhoods where bodies had been stacked too high to burn efficiently. Belisarius went directly to the palace. He was not arrested. He was not charged. He was simply ignored. Days passed, then weeks. He waited in the capital while Italy collapsed, while the Goths reconquered everything he had won, while generals he had trained led his strategies into disasters he could have prevented. Dispatches arrived describing defeat after defeat, and Belisarius could do nothing but read them and wait for an audience that never came. The humiliation was precise, calculated. Justinian did not need to accuse Belisarius of treason. The mere suggestion that he might be under suspicion was enough to destroy his influence. Courtiers who had once sought his favour now avoided him in the halls. Officers who had served under him pretended not to recognise his face. Antonina worked her channels. Theodora interceded. Slowly, over months, the frost began to thaw, not because Justinian's suspicions had eased, but because the military situation had become so desperate that pride had to yield to necessity. Italy was gone. The Gothic king Totila had proven himself a brilliant commander, routing every Roman force sent against him. The armies Belisarius had built were destroyed. The cities he had captured had fallen. Rome itself, held for a year against impossible odds, was under Gothic control once more. The empire needed Belisarius, again, still, always. The audience came in 544 AD. Justinian sat on his throne, surrounded by courtiers who watched the exchange with predatory attention, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The emperor did not apologize for the years of disgrace. He did not explain his suspicions. He simply stated facts. Italy required reconquest. Belisarius would command. Resources would be provided. The resources, when they materialized, were laughable. 4,000 men, a handful of ships, no siege equipment, no treasury for bribes or local recruitment. The emperor was sending Rome's greatest general to reconquer a peninsula with fewer soldiers than a Gothic nobleman might command for a border skirmish. Historians still debate whether this was incompetence or sabotage, whether Justinian genuinely believed Belisarius could work miracles with nothing, or whether the emperor was setting up his too successful general for a failure that would finally diminish his reputation. Belisarius sailed anyway. The Second Italian campaign was agony from the first day. Totila had learned from studying Belisarius's earlier victories. He refused to give battle on unfavourable terms, withdrew when threatened, attacked when the Romans were weakest. The same mobility that Belisarius had used to destroy the Vandals was now used against him. His letters to Constantinople pleaded for reinforcements. Justinian sent promises. Sometimes money arrived, never enough. Sometimes soldiers appeared, always too few. The general who had conquered Africa with 15,000 men now struggled to hold a single city with 400. The Italian population, exhausted by decades of war, had stopped caring who ruled them. Gothic or Roman, the armies brought only suffering. Belisarius found no local support, no joyful liberation, only sullen faces and closed doors in towns that had welcomed him a decade earlier. Yet he fought on. He recaptured Rome in 547, only to be ordered to abandon it when reinforcements failed to arrive. He won small victories that meant nothing in the larger collapse. He held lines that should have broken, defended positions that should have fallen, demonstrated over and over again that his genius was intact even as the resources to express it had been stripped away. The watching court took notes. See how he struggles, see how he fails. The legend is diminishing, the threat is fading. In 548 AD, Theodora died. The empress who had protected Antonina, and through Antonina Belisarius, was gone. The web of influence that had preserved the general through a decade of suspicion dissolved overnight. Justinian, freed from his wife's counsel, began to listen more closely to the enemies Belisarius had accumulated. The second recall came in 549 AD. This time, there would be no return to command. Italy would eventually be reconquered, but not by Belisarius. Other generals would complete the work he had started, and they would receive the credit he had earned. The final campaign came without warning. It was 559 AD. Belisarius had been in retirement for a decade, officially honoured, practically forgotten, living in his Constantinople mansion, while the empire he had built continued without him. The Gothic wars had ended. Italy was Roman again, though the victory belonged to the general Narses, who had finished what Belisarius started. The old warrior was in his late 50s now. His hair had greyed. The wounds accumulated over 30 years of combat ached in cold weather. He had accepted that his wars were over, that he would die in bed rather than in battle, that history had moved on without him. Then the Kutriger Huns crossed the Danube. They came in winter, when the frozen rivers offered highways into Roman territory. Thousands of mounted warriors, perhaps 7,000, perhaps more, pouring through the frontier defences, burning villages, slaughtering garrisons, riding south toward Constantinople itself. The capital had no army. The legions were scattered across Italy, Africa, the Persian frontier. The city walls, though magnificent, required defenders to hold them. Justinian had nothing. No soldiers, no generals, no plan. He had Belisarius. The summons came to the old general's house at midnight. Imperial messengers pounding on doors, torches guttering in the wind, the smell of fear sharp beneath the formal courtesy. The emperor requests, the emperor commands, the empire requires. Belisarius rode out the next morning with 300 men, 300, against 7,000. He gathered what forces he could find, retired veterans who still remembered how to hold a shield, city militia who had never faced cavalry in open field, a handful of his old bucellari who had refused to abandon him through all the years of disgrace. Perhaps 1,000 men in total, none of them proper soldiers by the standards of the armies he had once commanded. The Kutrigers had never faced Belisarius. They knew his name, every warrior in the world knew his name, but they had heard he was old, finished, a relic of wars their fathers had fought. They expected easy victory against a washed-up general leading farmers and shopkeepers. The battle outside the long wall should not have been possible. Belisarius used the terrain with the same brilliance he had shown at Dara, 29 years earlier. He concealed his cavalry in woods where the Huns could not see them. He positioned his infantry where they could not be flanked. He made his tiny force appear larger through careful distribution of banners and the deliberate creation of dust clouds. The Kutrigers attacked in the formation they always used, a sweeping cavalry charge designed to envelope and destroy inferior forces. They rode into a trap. Byzantine cavalry struck from the flanks. Infantry held the centre against charges that should have broken them. Belisarius himself rode through the chaos, his sword rising and falling, his voice cutting through the screaming of horses and men, directing every movement as if his 1,000 soldiers were extensions of his own body. The Huns broke. 400 of them died in the initial clash. The survivors fled north, spreading word of the defeat, warning their kinsmen that the Roman general was not as finished as they had believed. The raids continued for weeks. but the Kutrigers avoided any position where Belisarius might catch them. They had seen enough. The old lion still had teeth. Constantinople celebrated. The citizens who had cowered behind their walls poured into the streets to cheer the general who had saved them. For a moment, a brief, shining moment, it felt like the old days. Belisarius triumphant, the empire grateful, the future bright. Justinian watched from his palace window. He saw the crowds. He heard the name they chanted. He calculated how many of those cheering citizens might follow Belisarius if the general ever decided to reach for the throne. The emperor was 80 years old. He had ruled for 32 years. He had built churches, conquered kingdoms, reformed laws, survived plague and riot and Persian invasion. And still, after everything, the crowd chanted someone else's name. Historians still debate whether jealousy alone drove what followed, or whether Justinian had legitimate security concerns that the sources do not record. The outcome is beyond dispute. There was no second triumph for Belisarius, no reward for saving the capital. The general was thanked formally, dismissed quickly, returned to his mansion to await further service that would never come. The message was absolute. Even saving Constantinople was not enough. Even dying for the empire was not enough. Nothing Belisarius could do would ever be enough to erase the sin of being too good at his job. He returned home, he closed his doors, he waited. The waiting would last 3 more years, and then the system he had served would teach him what gratitude truly meant. The conspiracy was invented in 562 AD. There may have been conversations. There usually were, in the paranoid world of Byzantine court politics, men gathering in private chambers, whispering grievances about imperial policy, imagining alternatives that would never come to pass. Such conversations happened daily in Constantinople, and they rarely meant anything. But this conversation included names, powerful names, senators, officials, men whose ambitions had been thwarted by Justinian's long reign, and who wondered aloud what might happen if the aging emperor were removed. And somehow, impossibly, Belisarius's name appeared on the list. The sources disagree on how deeply the general was involved. Some suggest he attended a single meeting, listened to treasonous talk, and left without committing himself. Others insist he knew nothing, that his name was added by enemies seeking to destroy him. A few claim he genuinely considered overthrowing Justinian, that 3 decades of loyal service, rewarded with suspicion and humiliation, had finally broken something essential in his character. What is certain is this. In November 562, 3 men were brought before Justinian and accused of plotting assassination. Under torture, they named their co-conspirators. Belisarius's name was among them. The arrest came at night. Imperial guards surrounded his mansion. Torches illuminated the facades of neighbouring buildings, their light flickering across walls that had witnessed 100 triumphs and 100 disappointments. The smell of burning pitch, the sound of armoured boots on paving stones, the creak of the gate opening as soldiers filed into the courtyard where Belisarius had once reviewed his loyal Bucellari. He did not resist. He did not protest. He stood in his sleeping robes, grey-haired and exhausted, while men half his age searched his home for evidence of treason. They found nothing, no hidden weapons, no treasonous correspondence, no proof of any kind that Rome's greatest general had ever lifted a finger against the emperor he had served for 35 years. It did not matter. Belisarius was stripped of his rank. His property was seized, the mansion, the estates, the wealth accumulated through legitimate share of conquests that had doubled the empire's territory. His Bucellari were disbanded, their loyalty to their commander now evidence of dangerous personal power rather than military effectiveness. For nearly a year he lived in disgrace. Not prison, that would have required formal charges, a trial, the pretense of legal process. Instead, something worse, suspension. Existence in a grey zone where he was neither free nor condemned, neither citizen nor criminal. Antonina worked desperately to save him. She who had manipulated courts and seduced emperors now found herself powerless. Theodora was dead. The networks of influence had frayed. The enemies who had waited decades for this moment were not inclined to show mercy. Historians still debate whether the charges contained any truth. The evidence suggests fabrication, but in Byzantine politics, truth was rarely the point. What mattered was that Belisarius had finally been neutralized. The threat he posed, real or imagined, had been eliminated. Then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. In 563 AD, Justinian restored Belisarius to favour. The property was returned, the rank was reinstated. The old general was welcomed back to court as if the previous year had been a misunderstanding, an administrative error, an unfortunate necessity that everyone agreed to forget. No explanation was offered, no apology given. The system simply decided that Belisarius was no longer dangerous enough to warrant continued persecution. Perhaps Justinian realised the charges were false. Perhaps he calculated that a dead or imprisoned Belisarius would become a martyr, while a broken and dependent Belisarius could be controlled. Perhaps he simply needed someone to blame the conspiracy on, used Belisarius until other scapegoats emerged, and then discarded the pretense. The result was the same. Belisarius returned to his mansion. He resumed his place in society. He attended court functions and smiled at the men who had accused him and pretended that everything was normal. But the light had gone out of his eyes. Those who saw him in his final years described a man going through motions, a general who no longer discussed tactics, a husband who no longer fought for his wife's honour, a Roman who no longer believed in Rome. The system had taught him its final lesson. It did not matter how much you gave. It did not matter how loyal you remained. The empire used what it needed and discarded what it feared, and no amount of service could purchase safety. Belisarius had saved Rome from destruction. Rome had repaid him with blindness. Wait, not yet. The blindness came later. Or did it? The sources are confused on this point, and history has made them more so. But the degradation was real, the betrayal complete, and the ending already written. The legend says they blinded him. It is the detail everyone remembers about Belisarius. The image of Rome's greatest general, his eyes burned out, begging for coins at the gates of the city he saved. The scene has been painted by artists for centuries. It appears in poems, plays, novels. It is the perfect symbol of imperial ingratitude, of genius destroyed by mediocrity, of virtue punished by power. And it may not be true. The Byzantine sources are contradictory. Procopius, who knew Belisarius personally, does not mention blinding in any of his histories. The tradition appears later, in works written centuries after the events, by authors who may have confused Belisarius with other disgraced generals or simply invented details for dramatic effect. But here is what matters. The legend felt true. It felt true because Belisarius's actual fate was, in its own way, worse than blindness. The system that destroyed him did not need hot irons or physical mutilation. It had more sophisticated methods. After his restoration in 563, Belisarius lived 3 more years. He attended court. He received visitors. He existed in the strange twilight of a man who had been broken but not killed, humiliated but not executed, destroyed but not destroyed. The property returned was not all the property taken. The wealth restored was not all the wealth seized. He lived comfortably, but not lavishly, a permanent reminder that everything he possessed existed at the emperor's pleasure and could be taken again at any moment. His soldiers were gone. The Bucellari who had followed him across continents, who had charged Persian cataphracts and Gothic cavalry at his command, had been scattered to other units, or dismissed entirely. He had no army, he had no influence, he had nothing but his reputation, and even that had been tarnished by the conspiracy accusations. Antonina remained with him. Whatever her betrayals, whatever her manipulations, she did not abandon him in the end. The sources record no separation, no divorce, no final break. They grew old together in their diminished household, 2 survivors clinging to each other amid the wreckage of everything they had built. Historians still debate whether Belisarius understood what had happened to him, whether he recognized the pattern that had governed his entire career, the cycle of indispensability and suspicion, of triumph and punishment, of being needed and being feared. The evidence suggests he understood perfectly, and that understanding was perhaps the cruelest punishment of all, because Belisarius could not even claim betrayal. Justinian had not violated any explicit agreement. The emperor had never promised lifelong favour in exchange for lifelong service. The bargain between them had always been implicit, unstated, subject to revision based on circumstances neither controlled. What Justinian did was entirely within his rights as emperor. He used Belisarius when useful. He discarded Belisarius when dangerous. He restored Belisarius when the discarding proved excessive. Every action was legal, justified, defensible by Byzantine political standards. That was the horror of it. The system was not unjust, not by its own terms. It simply did not value what Belisarius had to offer in the way Belisarius hoped it would. He had given everything on the assumption that merit would be rewarded, that loyalty would purchase security, that the empire would recognize its debt to the man who had saved it. The empire recognized nothing. The empire owed nothing. The empire was a machine for preserving itself, and machines do not feel gratitude. Justinian died in November 565, 38 years into his reign. He was succeeded by his nephew Justin II, who inherited an empire vastly larger than the one Justinian had received, an empire that stretched from Spain to Persia, united under a single Christian emperor for the first time in generations. Belisarius outlived his emperor by only a few months. The exact date of his death is uncertain. March 565, some sources say. Others place it earlier or later. The details are vague because no one important was paying attention. The greatest general of his age died in obscurity, mourned by no one except his wife and whatever servants remained in his household. No state funeral, no monument, no official recognition that the man who had reconquered Africa and Italy and saved Constantinople from the Huns had finally stopped breathing. The system continued. The bureaucracy processed documents, the armies drilled, the taxes were collected, everything Belisarius had built endured. Only Belisarius himself was gone. And whether his eyes had been burned out or simply stopped seeing, the result was the same. The man who had seen farther than any general of his age ended his days in darkness. There is a church in Constantinople, Istanbul now, called the Hagia Sophia. Justinian built it in 537 AD, during the same years Belisarius was bleeding in Italy. It took 10,000 workers 5 years to construct. The dome alone required mathematical calculations that would not be fully understood for another 1,000 years. When Justinian entered the completed church for the first time, he reportedly whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." The Hagia Sophia still stands. It has survived earthquakes, conquests, religious conversions, the fall of empires and the rise of nations. Tourists from around the world visit it today, marveling at the engineering genius, the theological ambition, the sheer arrogance of an emperor who believed he could build a house worthy of God. They do not visit Belisarius's grave. No one knows where it is. The general who made Justinian's ambitions possible, who reconquered the territories that funded the construction, who held the empire together while architects and artists created wonders, that man vanished from memory so thoroughly that even his burial site was lost. This is not accident. This is policy. The Byzantine Empire that Belisarius served perfected the art of historical management. Court historians wrote the narratives that emperors approved. Inconvenient heroes were minimized. Useful villains were exaggerated. The story told afterward always served the interests of those currently in power. Belisarius was dangerous even in death. His legend could inspire others, generals who might dream of similar glory, soldiers who might transfer their loyalty from abstraction to individual. The safest course was erasure, not active condemnation, which might create martyrdom but quiet forgetting, the gradual slide into footnote status. It almost worked. For centuries, Belisarius was a minor figure in Byzantine historiography. Students learned about Justinian's conquests, Justinian's law codes, Justinian's churches. The general who actually accomplished the conquests appeared only in specialized texts. Then gradually the legend began to resurface. Western historians rediscovering the Byzantine sources found in Belisarius a hero of almost Homeric proportions. The story of the blind beggar, true or not, spread through European literature. Artists painted him. Poets memorialized him. A man whom his own empire had tried to forget became immortal through the admiration of strangers. But the immortality was complicated, because what survived was the tragedy, not the triumph. The image that endured was not Belisarius victorious at Dara or Carthage or Rome. It was Belisarius broken, Belisarius betrayed, Belisarius destroyed by the system he had served. Historians still debate whether this is the right lesson to draw from his life. Some argue he was a victim of paranoid tyranny, a good man crushed by an evil emperor. Others suggest he was complicit in his own destruction, too naive to understand the politics of power, too stubborn to bend when bending was required. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps neither captures the full complexity of a career spanning 30 years and 3 continents. What is certain is this: Belisarius did everything right. He won the battles, he served the emperor, he refused the crown when offered. He never wavered in his loyalty, never plotted against his sovereign, never gave Justinian legitimate cause for the suspicions that poisoned their relationship. And none of it mattered. The empire took what it needed and discarded what remained. The general who saved Rome was consumed by Rome. The man who rebuilt the imperial dream became evidence that dreams consume their builders. There is a lesson here, though it is not a comfortable one. Power does not reward service. Power exploits service. The difference between a hero and a threat is not competence or loyalty or virtue. It is timing, circumstance, the endless calculation of who is useful and who is dangerous. Belisarius was both. He could not be one without being the other, and in the end the threat outweighed the utility. He died in darkness, in silence, in a city that owed its survival to his sword and did not remember his name. The soldiers he had led went home to families who had forgotten their faces. The victories he had won were attributed to emperors who had watched from thrones. The legend that survived was not the one he would have chosen. Not the conqueror, not the genius, but the blind man begging at the gates. Flavius Belisarius, general of Rome, saviour of empires. The empire endured for 900 years after his death. It produced other generals, other heroes, other men who believed that service would be rewarded. None of them remembered the lesson. None of them ever do.